This is episode number 181 of the Mixology Talk podcast. And in this episode, we will be continuing our conversation around large format ice with a bartender, Huy Pham from Los Angeles. He's going to give us some tips, tricks, and some tools that we could use to break down large format ice for service. So stay tuned. Hi everyone, I am excited to have another special guest here. As you know, it's Ice Month, so we have the special guest, Huy Pham. So thanks so much for joining us on Ice Month, man.
Hey Chris, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so which bar do you work at again?
Right, so I work at Bar Jackalope, which is part of 7 Grand in Los Angeles. It's kind of the whiskey lounge inside the whiskey bar for 7 Grand. So I'm a whiskey curator there, so I just talk whiskey all day long. Other bartenders give me some grief because they're like, "Oh, it must be tough pouring whiskey all day." So that's where I'm coming from here.
Excellent. So I actually know the 7 Grand and the Umbrella Corporation, and you guys are doing some great work in Los Angeles, and just that particular restaurant group is fantastic.
Yeah, thank you, man. Actually, that's the reason I kind of got into ice in the first place, the bar and the group too. Mm-hmm. And you'll probably hear me talk about them the most just because I'm the most familiar with the way they use their ice and everything, and also just familiar with their bars.
Great. And so kind of touching on that subject, what got you started with ice as a focus in your career?
Absolutely. I think everyone's first experience with fancy ice is always like this big rock in like an old fashioned. I'm not any different. You know, I saw it and I was like, dang, that's pretty nice. The glass is nice. You know, this is a nice ambiance. The music's not too loud. Feel like an adult for once in my life. I'm not, drinking tequila shots right now. And that was my first experience. And honestly, I couldn't tell you even what bar that was. Like that was just number one time. But the first time I ran into actual hand carving of ice, actual cut ice, was at my bar, Bar Jackalope, when I was a guest there. And they used to, break down slabs of ice into rocks for cocktails, or for whiskey on the rocks, stuff like that, highballs. And so that was kind of the first time I ran into the concept of ice that wasn't out of an ice machine, or ice that wasn't out of an ice mold.
Great. And then, so what got you kind of down the rabbit hole of like starting to look at different types of ice and stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. So Bar Jackalope is a Japanese-inspired bar, but we're still an American bar at heart. And that's there's great things about that. America is the home of cocktails. It's where it came from. But Japan did this weird thing where they sort of went into hibernation. They just learned how to make cocktails and then ignored the rest of the world and kind of evolved in their own way. And when I started getting to visit Japan, when I started getting to know more about Japanese bartending, these small bars, these 10 to 15 seat bars, they don't have ice machines. They don't have any way of making ice. And so you start learning that everything is hand cut, everything's made of everything's bought from some manufacturer of ice warehouse, something, ice factory. And you just start getting to know more and more about the differences in why they choose to use what they use, and the same for American bars, even down to like the 2 different major ice manufacturers, Hoshizaki and Cold Draft. Why do you prefer? Which one do you prefer? Why do you use large cubes? Why do you use pebble ice for a Mai Tai, or don't use pebble ice for a Mai Tai? So it's just kind of the natural creeping into that last, like, how can I make this cocktail taste a little bit better or be a little bit more exciting?
Sure. And so I got to ask the question because I think, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but also this is kind of a natural conversation, especially around the high-end hand-cut ice program. And the question is, does it actually matter?
Yeah, it's a tough question, right? It's
right.
I've had some of the best cocktails in the world at places that use cold draft cubes to shake and, to pour on. I won't ever lie to you about that. But I think it's one of those things where it's another aspect of control you can take over. It's kind of like, why empty your bitters bottles into a different dasher, or why juice your own citrus instead of having someone else juice it for you? It's because you can control the aspects of it a little bit more. It doesn't necessarily increase the quality, but once you understand why you're doing it and you have that control over it, you can say, oh, I like large cubes because they dilute slower, so I can control the size of my large cubes. Or my glassware doesn't fit this cube exactly, so that we can make a slightly smaller cube. And all these small things just start adding up to get that last 1% to 2% of how good a cocktail can taste like.
Got it. Okay. I definitely agree with you. I remember, I think I've brought this up in a couple of podcasts before, but I entered a Mai Tai contest a long time ago. And I was having a hard time just kind of getting it right. I couldn't quite figure it out. And then I tried pebble ice in it, and I was like, oh, that was it. That's all I needed. I just changed up my ice. And then at that point, I was like, okay, all right, ice makes a huge difference with dilution and chilling and all these small things that just can't get replicated elsewhere in the cocktail. But yeah, it was kind of an eye-opening aha moment for me as well around ice. Just that small difference it makes, but it can really have a big, big impact on the cocktail.
And I think even the quality of aesthetics alone isn't something to be overlooked. A lot of people, I think us Americans, we have a very practical approach. Like, tell me what you're really doing. Why does this even matter? But like, no one wants to drink out of a glass with like water smudges on it. No one wants to, be at a nice bar and drink out of like a solo cup. Like, these small touches make you more excited. The drink tastes better, even if it doesn't actually taste better.
Agreed. Yeah, absolutely. So the last podcast we talked to Gordon from Penny Pound Ice, and he talked about all the processes and all the work that goes into making these large 300-pound blocks and then cutting them down into smaller slabs or even cubes for bars. So can you talk a little bit about the process that you have when you receive a slab from him, and how do you break down that ice either for service or during service?
Of course. So the format I'm used to, just because I work in LA, I know Gordon personally, I buy from Penny Pound. They have 13-pound blocks of ice. They're 5x7x12, I want to say, that they sell to consumers if they want them. Mm-hmm. And so that usually for me starts with a saw. So it's a hand saw, not too large actually, probably in the order of like maybe 16 inches or so. I bought mine from a Japanese retailer just because their culture just has more hand sawing with ice. It's not necessarily, I don't think there's any reason that they can make a saw that Americans can't. It's just no one buys saws for ice in America. So there's just no manufacturers for it. And so that's the first step. That's kind of to break it down for the major block. And then after I usually cut it into, for better or worse, like 2-inch slices, if you want to consider it that way. Mm-hmm. At that point, you can start cracking it a couple different ways. I use a soba or a udon knife. It's usually used for noodles, but the great part about it is it's exactly flat. There's no curve to the knife. Most knives that we use in our kitchens are curved because that slice is easier. But with ice, you can't slice it like an onion. You have to start the cracks and you have to kind of force it through. And it's usually at that point I'm using either a wooden mallet or a rubber mallet. I'm more comfortable with the wooden mallet, but I know, like, for instance, Ueno-san from Bar High Five uses a rubber mallet, and you can use that to actually cut the ice without at that point sawing off or shredding any more ice. So the saw, you will lose some ice because obviously the kind of like if you saw wood, there's sawdust, the equivalent of sawdust with ice. You're going to lose that ice. But once you get to the point with the knife, you can actually just start cracking the ice cleanly. And I know Gordon talked about it already, but there's the same considerations in terms of the feel of the ice. You have to let it get up to temperature. It can't be too cold because then you'll just start cracking it. It'll shatter. It's a lot of feeling, actually. I'm by no means, the Japanese apprentice who's worked 10 years with ice before. But as I kept doing it over and over, it becomes a lot more intuitive. Things feel a lot more straightforward. You get an understanding of when you can crack it and when you shouldn't crack it yet, when you should give it a second. And so it's kind of, in a way, like just like when you use your bar tools more, you get more comfortable with them and you get more comfortable with your ice. Got
it. Excellent. So if I understand the process correctly, you have this kind of large slab of ice that gets delivered to you. First thing you do is you grab a handsaw, and I imagine it's a toothed handsaw.
It is a toothed handsaw. Would props help? I don't know if they would.
Yeah, we're on video, so we'd love to see it. Okay, yeah, all right. So that's a pretty aggressive tooth count.
The teeth are really aggressive because that's just what works. It's just what works for ice.
Yeah.
And it tends to slice better on one direction, and then you can just push it back without hopefully too much friction, and then pull it again to keep sawing downward.
Got it. Okay, so then that's where you kind of make your initial cuts to kind of break them down into 2x2 kind of.
Yeah, once you have that big cube, you can kind of think of it as like slicing the cube. So you want like
Got it.
Of like 2 inches, but it's still the same width and length. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. And then after that point, it's a lot easier to handle, I imagine. So that's when you bring out your udon knife, your soba knife, and you start cracking them down into smaller cubes.
And if your ice is the right temperature, you run this knife back and forth, and then you basically start an incision and a crack into the ice, you'll actually hear a soft little starting of crack of going down the ice. And at that point, you can tap it with a mallet, and it'll actually go ahead and force that incision all the way through the ice. And so you should just get a clean break between the two pieces of whatever size.
And so for anybody that's not on video here, let me describe this udon noodle knife, noodle knife. Imagine a meat cleaver, but where you put your hand, imagine that the blade extends underneath your knuckles for probably another, 6 inches, 5 inches or so?
Absolutely, yeah.
Basically, it's a big, giant metal, just straight line that you're driving through the ice, essentially. Yeah,
and it looks like a meat cleaver, but it's actually pretty delicate. Ice is surprisingly delicate. The sawing is a bit aggressive, that's true, but it's surprisingly a lot of finesse.
Sure, absolutely. And then from that point, you're just shaving it in a shape, probably with a smaller hand knife, I would imagine.
Depending on what you want, even just a regular paring knife. I think the number one thing that I've struggled with in the past is everything has to be really sharp. So either sharpen your own knives, get them professionally sharpened, whatever else. But ice responds really well to sharp knives. It cuts very cleanly, but if it's not sharp, you're just kind of hacking at it. It gets a little weird. It can chip, it can shatter. But yeah, even like a regular paring knife at that point will work.
Got it. Okay. And then here's kind of a random follow-up question to that. How do you keep your hands from getting frozen all the time? Because I imagine the process of shaving down one of those, cubes into like a shape, it probably takes a little bit of time, right?
So you're right. So I'm a bit, there's two ways. One is I use a lot of towels. So there's like separation from the ice in your hands. But the other one is kind of sometimes you just get used to it. It just becomes just like, I'm sure as an experienced bartender yourself, you're used to going from hot water to ice cold, like water right away. And, chefs, I'm sure have the same experience, but you just get used to it over time. It's not something you struggle with. I guess one thing I also forgot to mention is the classic ice ball. If you want to go all the way down to ice ball, that's usually done with a three-pronged pick. Mm-hmm. Even those deluxe picks that I'm sure many of you have seen for $8 to $10, that wood and metal deluxe pick, I actually think that's like the best pick I've used besides much more expensive ones, like easily 5 times more expensive ice picks. That's just you constantly rotating and chipping until it gets into a ball shape, essentially.
Got it. Okay, cool. And the ball shape with hand cut is usually kind of rough, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes, actually, it's people are like, oh, completely spherical ice, very great surface area. It's like, well, if you're hand cutting it, it's actually not perfect. It's interesting. The philosophy behind the ice ball is less that it's the perfect, there's ice molds to make ice balls that are going to be better. And there's melters that are just the metal ones you just drop on. They're going to be more perfect. One of the big things about that is kind of showing off your craft, showing off that you can do it. It's saying like, I care enough about this drink that I put this effort into this ice ball.
Got it. Okay. I've seen a couple of videos. I've never actually tried it before, but I will say it looks pretty impressive when it's done right.
Yeah, it's I'm still quite slow at it, but it's fun. It's actually funny, again, Ueno, because he's one of the few English-speaking bartenders from Japan. He's a resource that I look up online all the time. I've had the chance to meet him, luckily. He actually talks about it at one point, and he says, yeah, as an apprentice, you're working at this bar for 5 years or something like that. You're not making cocktails. So actually, making those ice balls is one of the ways you can show off that you're working on your craft to a customer, because usually the apprentices are making them before service.
Okay, that's cool. Yeah, and it's a pretty impressive sight to watch somebody just chip away at this thing too.
Yeah.
So when you break down these ice cubes, how many different types of ice do you break them down into for your drinks?
Absolutely. So as many as you want. The one thing I will say I have had less success with, it's hard to beat pebble ice. Those pebble ice machines are really nice. I'm a big fan of pebble ice. It works. It's cheap. It's great for what you want it for.
Right.
But other than that, I actually prefer cracking down ice for everything else. And so it really depends on what you want out of it. Like if you want a slow dilution for already chilled down drinks, say you're stirring a Vieux Carré and you're pouring it onto a big rock, you want as basically the rock to fill up almost the entire glass. So it's a very large size. But even for like an old fashioned, if you want it to melt in the glass a little bit, to cool down in the glass a little bit, you might want cracked ice, smaller sizes, maybe 2 or 3 cubes in there. So there's more surface area. The ice sphere is the classic, whiskey on the rocks if you want to show off to your friends, or you might want like a long ice sphere if you want to do a long drink served cold. That is diluting slower as well. Even like as simple as a lemonade, but obviously, we're more likely to make something like a like a Tom Collins and that thing.
Got it. Excellent. And then, so we have rocks, crushed ice, we have spheres, and then long ice. Is there anything else you usually break a big format ice cube into?
I think that will be most of it. I think the one thing that might surprise some people is that I also like to shake, and a lot of bars actually are starting to do this now, like to shake with large format ice. And so that's also there's a control aspect to that there, but they're all rocks in shape. It's just what size of rock you're looking for.
Got it. Okay. And are you using the large format ice, like a old fashioned size cube of ice when you shake?
Yeah. So I personally, again, because I'm a stupid nerd, I like using cobbler shakers. I have Japanese cobbler shakers, so I actually prefer using around 3 to 4 cubes for more clear spirits, more like gin cocktails, and maybe 2 to 3 cubes for brown spirits cocktails like a sidecar. And that ends up giving me the dilution and sort of the ice cracking in the shaker I'm looking for. But if you work with like a milk and honey style bar like Varnish, I've noticed that they just use one large old fashioned style cube for shaking in Boston shakers. So it's actually a very aggressive shake. And it's a different technique you would use than if you had a cold draft filled up in your Boston shakers.
Right. And that sound, man, of putting one giant cube in a shaker, that's intense.
Yeah, it's intense.
Just that banging back and forth.
And actually, Dave Arnold, who is the guy who will never, ever admit anything unless you can prove it scientifically, does prefer shaking with large format ice because he gets more aeration out of it. You'll notice the texture of the drink is actually significantly different. So, it's for some reason, I don't know the physics at all. I have zero clue how it works, but you'll notice that you get a lot more almost fizz out of like a sour or something, like more foam, more aeration out of a sour with one large block than with like 6 cold draft cubes.
Oh, super cool. Okay. All right. So when you're designing cocktails, how do you choose the type of ice? Is it based off of like cocktail families? Like, with a sour, you use this style of ice for a presentation or for the build? How do you kind of go down that process of matching ice with a final drink?
Yeah, let's break it down into sort of 2 different ways, which is one is ice for, I know I actually watched one of your really old podcasts on this about like serving ice versus, cocktail, like mixing ice, right?
And so I'll be honest with you, that was a point of time a long time ago. So.
Bartending evolves, man. Bartending is...
There's a lot of evolution happening.
Bartending evolves, man. But I think that's still a good sort of concept to break it down between because, like you said, for a sour, you're probably going to serve it up. So for that, my ice tends to be, like I said, the large format ice is going to be more dense. So it tends to allow you to shake and have more control without it shattering in your shaker and without it starting to just dilute as shards. Mm-hmm. But I tend to want smaller cubes and a more aggressive shake so that there is still some shattering. There is still some more of that aggressive dilution. With a gimlet or a daiquiri, I think most of us like it a bit more refreshing, a bit more chilled and a bit more aerated. But if you have something like a sidecar again, or something like some other shaken brown spirits whiskey cocktail, you're not really quite going for as refreshing or as bright to me personally. Mm-hmm. So I tend to use larger cubes and less of them, so that way there's less of that shattering, less of the edges falling off. And sort of the same approach for stirred cocktails, though I tend to use the same ice for stirred cocktails. You don't want a bunch of edges. You don't want a bunch of cubes that are very small, so that the dilution is something that kind of runs away from you.
Got it. Okay. And then probably a similar approach to service then is probably if you're going to do like a long style drink, you probably just match it with that long style cocktail ice. If it's a Collins or a highball or something like that, you're probably going to match it with a glassware essentially. Absolutely.
I think aside from old fashioned styled or build style cocktails, usually you have your cocktail at your desired temperature and you just want to maintain it in a long drink or a rocks drink. So you typically want larger cubes for that and just basically what fits the glass.
Cool. Okay. And there's definitely that aesthetic component to it as well.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So being kind of like focused in this style of bartending, Japanese style bartending in particular with ice, is there anything that you're kind of seeing now that you're really kind of excited to either experiment with or kind of try in the future?
Yeah, I was actually thinking that one thing I'm excited to see, but not for myself, is that more and more people now, since there's no real, depending on where you are, there's not many bars to go out to or any bars to go out to. I've seen more people get excited about having like those big, nice blocks in their old fashions at home, and that's really cool to me. As for myself and learning more about ice, I would just love to be able to, Penny Pound is amazing, but there's so many other ice factories out there. I want to see how other people make ice. I want to see how other people cut it. I've seen all sorts, I've seen people using ice a la minute, just cutting during service and breaking down a big block while they build new cocktails. And I've seen individually packaged ice and all that stuff. So I'm just excited to see all that stuff. I think more and more it's going to become more normal to also use it for shaking and stirring cocktails, depending on the size of the bar, especially a smaller bar that maybe can spend more time on each cocktail. Mm-hmm. And so I'm excited about that too.
Cool. And then, so we had one question from our Facebook group I kind of want to hit on real quick. And obviously you buy your ice from Penny Pound, but it sounds like you experiment a lot as well. Do you have any kind of experience or tips or anything for freezing items in ice?
That one I actually have zero experience with. Yeah, I'm sure it would work great. And I've seen great cocktail recipes with like frozen coffee or juices, but actually freezing items in ice, I haven't played with. I know, not to betray my heart, Penny Pound, but I know the guys over at West Coast Ice Provisions in Los Angeles do a lot of more like logos and stuff in terms of freezing in ice for like events and things like that. So I've seen that as well coming out, but I haven't really seen or experimented from the home bartender experience.
Yeah, I've seen I know Camper English is kind of a big focus with freezing stuff in ice and directional freezing and all that for home. So I haven't had the chance to kind of go down that rabbit hole. But I know that I've seen his Instagram account. It just seems like he's doing some pretty cool stuff. I always see like random frozen objects and ice cubes. I'm like, that's crazy, man.
And again, someone like Camper English is probably better than myself. I can't help you there. But if you want to, do large format ice at home, you want to have that, cooler full of ice in your freezer that you pull out a nice block from. You're going to have to break it down the same way. At the end of the day, you're going to have to break it down the same way.
Cool. And then last question for you, actually probably one or two last ones, but what's your biggest tip for anybody that's going to be looking into breaking down large format ice, either for the home or for a bar program? Yeah,
I think we talked tools earlier. So step one is just, I don't think you need to splurge on any of the tools. The most expensive thing is going to be the saw. Mm-hmm. Any Soba knife will do. It doesn't have to be expensive. Mine's actually like fairly cheap, I think in the $20 range. So get a set of tools that you're comfortable with, get to know them a little bit. And then from there, I think it's just experience and patience. The first time you break down an ice block, it's going to take you forever. It's just going to take you forever. And then after that, you'll get faster and faster and you'll chip it less, you'll shatter it less. And it's just, it's, I think, very satisfying, and you'll understand more about ice just by the fact you do it. You'll start noticing little nuances like, I prefer my ice a little bit bigger in this glass, or I prefer my ice a little bit smaller in my shaker. And you'll just notice these things over time.
Cool. Awesome. And this will be the last question, I promise. Is there anything you'd like to promote, anything you're working on, or any social media platform that you'd love to send people to?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's just my Instagram. This is just me me for fun, my way of hanging out with the other bartenders and trying to show them what I'm doing and see what they're doing. It's called White Heron Project, like the bird. So just check that out on Instagram. I'd love to hear what you're up to. I'd love to hear your thoughts on ice. Shoot me questions on my cocktails. I have some of my old bartender friends from 7 Grand just running into cocktail posts being like, all right, but what grapefruit do you use for that grapefruit juice? And so it's just stuff like that's always a fun discussion. I love nerding out, and I love discussing like even down to that granular detail level.
Very cool. We'll definitely have links to your Instagram account and the tools that you mentioned in the show notes over at mixologytalk.com/181. But Huy, you're amazing. I cannot thank you enough for your time and your expertise and sharing all things ice with us, man.
All right, Chris, thank you so much. I hope you have a good day, man.
Yeah, you too. Thank you. So once again, thank you to Huy Pham for joining us and sharing his expertise around breaking down large format ice for service and all the tools and tricks that he's got. I definitely learned a lot, and hopefully you guys did as well. So we're going to have some more episodes for you in the future, but this kind of ends Ice Month for us. We definitely learned a lot, but I'm definitely looking forward to next month when we're going to be covering and talking to experts in smoke. So stay tuned.